The moment Augusta Brooks walked through the door of the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office, clutching a leather satchel against her chest, like it held the last breath of air on earth, every man in that room looked away. It was the spring of 1882 in Redemption Creek, a dust-blown cattle town perched on the edge of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind never really stopped, and the sky went on forever in every direction like God himself had stretched it thin. The town had been carved out of nothing more than ambition and stubbornness, and it showed in the crooked angles of its buildings, and the perpetual layer of red dirt that coated everything from the church steps to the saloon's piano keys. It was the kind of place where men made fortunes and lost them inside the same calendar year, where cattle drives thundered through twice a season and left money and trouble in equal measure, and where the law was only as strong as the man wearing the badge. Augusta was 28 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had already survived more than most people would be asked to endure in 2 lifetimes. Her dark hair was pinned back practically under a gray bonnet. Her dress was simple but clean, and her brown eyes held something that went beyond grief. They held the particular, quiet fire of a woman who has made a decision and will not be turned from it no matter how many doors get shut in her face. She had been walking through shut doors for 3 weeks. Her husband, Thomas Brooks, had been a rancher. Not the richest man in the Panhandle, not by a long stretch, but honest and hardworking and decent in the way that decent men in that country had to be, which meant quietly and without drawing attention to it. Thomas had been found dead on the eastern edge of his own property 6 weeks ago, the official cause listed by the county coroner as a riding accident. His horse, they said, had thrown him near the dry creek bed and his skull had met a rock on the way down. A tragedy, they said. A terrible, senseless tragedy. Augusta had been at his grave before the dirt had even fully settled, and she had known then, standing in the thin morning light with her hands folded and her heart broken clean in half, that it was no accident. She had known because of what Thomas had told her 2 nights before he died. She had known because of the papers he had pressed into her hands in the dark of their bedroom, with a look on his face she had never seen before. She had known because of what she had found hidden inside the false bottom of his desk 3 days after the funeral, when she had been sorting through his things and her fingers had touched something that was not wood. What she had found was a collection of documents that Thomas had gathered over the course of nearly a year. Signed land surveys, altered deeds. A correspondence between a man named Clarence Holt, who was the largest cattle baron in the entire Panhandle region, and a county land commissioner named Fetterman. The letters spoke plainly, in the clipped, careful language of men who were used to getting what they wanted. They outlined a scheme by which Holt and his associates had been systematically forging land transfers across 3 counties, stealing properties from smaller ranchers either by deception or, when that failed, by harsher methods. Thomas had been investigating this quietly for months. Thomas had gotten too close. Augusta had taken this evidence to the county magistrate first. The magistrate had listened with his fingers laced together on his desk, nodded slowly several times, and then told her that grief could make a person see conspiracies where there were none, and that she ought to go home and rest. She had gone to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the county seat requesting an inquiry. The reply had come back within 2 days, terse and dismissive, citing insufficient cause. She had tried the local newspaper, the Redemption Creek Courier, and the editor had turned pale when she spread the documents on his desk and had told her, very carefully, that he was not in a position to print such allegations without official backing. She had understood from the look on his face that he was afraid. She could not blame him for being afraid. She was afraid too, but being afraid and doing nothing were not the same thing, and she had decided they would never be the same thing for her. So she had come to the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning when the light was still low and thin, and she had pushed open the door, and every man in the room had looked away. There were 3 of them inside. Deputy Calloway, A soft-faced man in his 30s who was very good at collecting his salary and very bad at anything else his job required, stood near the window pretending to study something outside it with great interest. Deputy Marsh sat behind a desk and suddenly found the grain of the wood deeply fascinating. And Sheriff Amos Pruitt himself, a thick-necked man of 52 with a silver mustache that he maintained with evident personal pride, looked up at Augusta from his chair with an expression of polite, implacable reluctance. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, which was at least an acknowledgment that she existed, which was more than she had gotten from the magistrate. "Sheriff Pruitt," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced making it steady. "I have evidence of land fraud and possible murder, and I would like someone in this office to look at it." Pruitt's expression did not change by so much as the angle of one silver mustache hair. "We've been over this," he said. "Husband's death was ruled accidental by the coroner. The coroner is paid a retainer by Clarence Holt's Land Company," Augusta said. "That is a serious allegation, Mrs. Brooks. I have documents that are a great deal more serious than an allegation." Pruitt leaned back in his chair and the leather creaked in the silence. Calloway was still studying the outside world through the window. Marsh was still studying the desk. Nobody moved. "I understand this has been a difficult time," Pruitt said carefully. "Losing Thomas was hard on this whole community. But chasing after Clarence Holt with a satchel full of papers you found in a desk is not going to bring your husband back, and it is not going to do anything good for you or your situation. Holt employs a third of this county. His cattle drives keep this town fed. I'm not in the business of setting this community on fire over the truth," Augusta asked. The silence that followed that question had a specific texture, the texture of men who had made a choice they were not entirely comfortable with but had made anyway and were now defending the consequences of it with their silence. Augusta stood there in that silence for a long moment. She looked at Pruitt. She looked at Calloway. She looked at Marsh. Not one of them met her eyes. And then the door at the back of the room opened and a man walked through it carrying a tin coffee cup in one hand and a folded wanted notice in the other, and he stopped when he saw her. He was not a deputy. She could see that immediately because he was not wearing a badge. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with a lean, weathered quality that came from years of working in sun and wind rather than the bloated look of a man who sat indoors. His dark hair needed cutting, and his jaw needed a razor, and the lines around his eyes were the kind that came from squinting into distance, and from something more interior than that. He wore simple range clothes, a canvas shirt and work trousers tucked into boots that had seen significant mileage, and there was a revolver on his hip worn in the practiced, unthinking way of a man who had carried one long enough that it felt like a natural extension of himself rather than a decoration. He looked at Augusta. He looked at the satchel she was clutching. He looked at the three silent lawmen. And something in his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something considerably more attentive. "What's going on?" he asked, not of Augusta but of the room in general, which was still characterized by its comprehensive silence. Pruitt cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brooks was just leaving," he said. "I was not," Augusta said. The man with the coffee cup looked at her properly then, the kind of look that was actually paying attention rather than performing the idea of it. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Elijah Sheridan. I'm not a deputy, I'm just a man passing through, but I can see plain enough that there's something that needs addressing here and these gentlemen aren't inclined to address it." He paused. "What's in the satchel?" Augusta looked at him for a beat. 3 weeks of closed doors and polite dismissals, and careful silence had made her cautious. But there was something in the directness of his gaze, something without performance or agenda in it, that made her answer honestly. "Evidence," she said. "Evidence that a man named Clarence Holt has been defrauding ranchers across 3 counties for years by forging land transfers and altering property deeds. And evidence, I believe, that my husband was killed because he uncovered it." The room was quiet again. But this time the quality of the silence was different because Elijah Sheridan did not look away. "Let me see it," he said. Pruitt pushed his chair back. Now hold on just a. I'd like to see it, Elijah said again, not loudly, but with a quality of steadiness in his voice that made Prout stop pushing his chair back. He set his coffee cup down on the nearest surface, tucked the wanted notice into his breast pocket, and crossed the room to where Augusta was standing. He stopped a respectful distance from her. If you're willing to share it with me, ma'am. I want to be clear, I'm not a lawman and I can't make any official promises. But I will look at it, and I will not pretend I don't see what I see. Augusta studied his face for a moment. The morning light from the window was behind him, catching the dust on his hat brim. His eyes were gray, she noticed, or somewhere between gray and green in the uncertain way of eyes that changed with the light. He was looking at her with an attention that felt, against all her recent experience of the opposite, like genuine respect. She opened the satchel and handed him the documents. Elijah carried them to the window where the light was better and began to read. Not skimming, not performing the gesture of reading. Actually reading, working through each page methodically, his expression growing progressively more focused as he moved through the papers. Prout watched from his chair with the look of a man watching a fuse burn toward something he would prefer not to see explode. Calloway had finally turned from the window. Marsh had stopped studying his desk. It took Elijah 11 minutes to read through everything. Augusta watched him read and thought about Thomas, about the way he had looked in those last days, careful and alert in a way that had frightened her even before she understood why. Thomas had been a quiet, methodical man who had believed in the law the way some people believed in God, with a faith that was fundamental and not easily shaken. And the law had gotten him killed, or rather the men who were supposed to uphold it had gotten him killed through their complicity and their cowardice, and she was standing in a room full of the same variety of men being looked at by the one exception she had encountered in 3 weeks. Elijah lowered the papers and looked at Prout. "This is a signed correspondence between Holt and Fetterman," he said. "It specifically discusses altering a survey record for the Delacroix property in May of last year." "Could be forgeries," Prout said. "Could be," Elijah said evenly. "That's what an investigation would determine." He held up a second document. "This is a land transfer for the Acker Ranch, transferring ownership to a holding company associated with Holt's Land Trust. The Ackers, unless I'm mistaken, never sold their property. They were foreclosed on a bank note 6 months ago, and the bank was, he checked the paper, Sunrise Territorial Banking, which shares an address with Holt's Land Company offices in Amarillo." He looked at Prout. "Sheriff." Prout said nothing. "This woman's husband is dead," Elijah said. "And there is a file here thick enough to put a man in a federal prison, and you are sitting in that chair." "Elijah," Prout said, and there was a warning in it. "Do you know each other?" Augusta asked before she could stop herself. "I know him by reputation," Prout said carefully. "I came through here 3 years back," Elijah said to Augusta, without offering any more explanation than that. He turned back to Prout. "Are you going to do anything with this?" The pause that stretched out from Prout was long enough to contain entire negotiations, second thoughts, calculations about consequence, and the ultimate surrender of a man who has made up his mind well in advance of the question being asked. "My hands are tied," he said finally. "Holt has got friends in the county seat and friends in Austin. I can't move on a man like that without backing from above, and I do not have it." "Then I'll find someone who does," Elijah said. He handed the documents back to Augusta, who took them with a steadiness that surprised her given how hard her heart was beating. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "if you're agreeable, I'd like to help you take this to the U.S. Marshal's office in Amarillo. They have federal jurisdiction, and they don't answer to Holt's friends in the county seat. It's a 3-day ride, and I won't pretend it would be without risk, but I believe this evidence warrants it." Augusta looked at this man, this Elijah Sheridan who had walked through a back door with a coffee cup and chosen, without apparent hesitation, to pick up something every other man in the territory had refused to touch. She thought about Thomas again. She thought about the 12 acres of land that Holt's lawyers had already sent her a letter regarding, with language so smooth and legal, and carefully considered that it had taken her 2 readings to understand they were threatening her. She thought about how alone she had been for 3 weeks in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of Thomas's voice from the house. "I'm agreeable," she said. They left the sheriff's office 20 minutes later, walking out into the spring morning of Redemption Creek with Prout watching through his window and the town going about its ordinary business around them. Augusta kept the satchel close against her side. Elijah walked beside her at an unhurried pace, and the first thing he said to her outside was not something strategic or logistical. He said, "I'm sorry about your husband." And there was something in the simplicity of it, the absence of the careful, cushioning language everyone else had wrapped around the same sentiment, that made Augusta's throat tighten unexpectedly. She swallowed it down. "Thank you," she said. "How long ago did you find those papers?" 3 weeks. I have been to the magistrate, the county seat by telegram, and the newspaper." He glanced at her, and the newspaper editor looked like he wanted to disappear through his own floor. "Something very much like that," she agreed. "Holt's influence runs deep out here," Elijah said. It was not an excuse he was offering, just a fact he was naming. "That's why you need federal jurisdiction. A U.S. Marshal doesn't care who Holt knows in Austin." "Are you familiar with how these things work?" she asked. "I've had occasion to learn," he said, which was one of those answers that contained considerably more than its words. Augusta noted it but did not press. They had time, apparently, and she would come to understand who this man was not by interrogating him but by watching him. They made practical arrangements with a speed and efficiency that Augusta found, after weeks of encountering the opposite of efficiency, almost startling. Elijah had a horse, a broad-backed bay gelding named Canaan, who looked approximately as steady and untroubled as his owner. Augusta had her own mare, a gray named December, whom she had owned since before her marriage, and who was one of the things she would have put up a fight to keep even if the lawyers took everything else. They agreed to leave at first light the following morning, which gave Augusta a day to arrange matters and gather what she needed for the journey. Elijah helped her without being asked, without making a production of it, and without the hovering, managing quality that she had encountered in men who wanted to help in a way that put them in charge. He simply did what was useful. He helped her check December's shoes and found one loose enough to need attention, and he took the mare to the farrier himself, while Augusta went to tell her neighbor, old Mrs. Pell, that she would be away for a few days and to ask her to watch the property. He met her back at the livery without fanfare and reported the mare was sorted. When she mentioned she needed to stop by the general store, he said he would wait with the horses. She found herself, in the small spaces between errands, watching him in the peripheral way women learn to observe the world when they are trying to understand something without making the understanding too visible. He was not what she would have called a conventional-looking man. The weathering of his face gave him an age that his eyes contradicted, because his eyes were quick and quietly amused by the world in the way of younger men. He moved through the town the way a man moves when he is perpetually aware of his surroundings, but not performing that awareness, naturally alert rather than theatrically watchful. The people he spoke to during the course of the day, the farrier, a man at the livery, the woman at the general store, they all responded to him with the particular ease of people, in the presence of someone who is not trying to be anything other than what they are. That evening, Augusta returned to her house for the last time in what she knew might be a while. The house was a small wood-frame structure on the edge of the Brooks ranch, which had shrunk from the original 300 acres Thomas had built up to the current contested 87 acres that Holt's lawyers were circling. She walked through the rooms in the lamplight and felt the weight of the place, the years of ordinary living it had absorbed into its walls, the smell of the kitchen that was uniquely and irreplicably the smell of her life with Thomas. She missed him. She missed him with the specific, relentless ache of someone who has lost not only a person but a daily architecture, the whole framework of small moments that living with someone constructs. She had cried exactly twice in 6 weeks, both times alone, and she did not consider this stoicism. She considered it simply the work of continuing, which was what she was doing. She packed what she needed, not much, with the practical directness of a woman who had never romanticized inconvenience. She made sure the documents were secured in the satchel with the oilskin inner lining Thomas had made himself. She cleaned and loaded the small pistol she kept in the desk drawer, which Thomas had taught her to use the summer after they were married, and she tucked it into her coat pocket. She was not expecting trouble. But 3 weeks of having nobody believe her, and one afternoon of having one man look her in the eye, had given her a fresh appreciation for the importance of not leaving things entirely to chance. Dawn found them at the north edge of town, the sky still purple-gray, and the air carrying the last coolness of the night. Canaan was loaded and steady. December tossed her head once at the chill, and then settled into the long, rhythmic walk that Augusta had ridden behind for years. Elijah rode easy in the saddle, hat low, the early light catching nothing in particular. They left Redemption Creek behind them at a pace that would cover good ground without punishing the horses, and the town shrank gradually in the distance like something drawn in by its own horizon. They did not talk excessively during that first day's riding. Augusta had expected, or feared, the performative conversation of a man who felt obligated to fill silence, and instead she got a man who was entirely comfortable not speaking, which was its own gift. They talked when there was something to say, and the things they said were direct and purposeful and occasionally, without either of them planning it, genuinely interesting. He asked her about Thomas carefully, in a way that made it feel less like an interrogation and more like a natural extension of the territory they were crossing together. She found herself talking about her husband with a freedom that surprised her, describing the man he had been rather than the grief-smoothed version of him she had been presenting to the world. Thomas's stubbornness about the range water rights, his terrible singing, which he persisted in performing entirely without self-consciousness. The way he had kept every letter she had ever written him, which she had discovered sorting through his desk, and which had undone her more thoroughly than anything else in the aftermath of his death. Elijah listened without rushing her past the edges of things. He asked questions that were perceptive without being intrusive. When she stopped talking, he did not try to draw more out of her. It was, she thought, a very specific kind of decency, the kind that required someone to actually be paying attention rather than just waiting for their turn. In the afternoon, when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that ran thin but clear between limestone banks, she asked him where he was from. He was quiet for a moment, watching Canaan drink. "Missouri, originally," he said, "though I left that a good while ago. What brought you through Redemption Creek?" "I was following a piece of business," he said. He glanced at her sideways with the ghost of something dry in his expression. "The wanted notice I had in my pocket this morning was for a man I've been tracking for about 2 months. Turns out he passed through Redemption Creek and headed north 3 weeks ago, so I'm not on a particularly fresh trail at the moment. Coming into the sheriff's office this morning was mostly to confirm that and figure out a new direction." "You're a bounty hunter?" she asked. He considered the word. "I've done that work," he said. "Among other things, I've worked cattle, I've done some scouting. I'm not a man who stayed in one place long enough to call it a profession in the strict sense." "Do you want to?" she asked, and then wondered if it was too direct a question for the situation. He turned it over in his mind visibly, which she appreciated because it meant he was actually answering rather than deflecting. "I think I've been waiting to want to," he said, "if that makes sense." She looked out at the creek and thought about what that meant. "It makes some sense," she said. They made camp that first night on a flat rise above a dry draw, where they could see the country open up around them for a considerable distance, and where the wind moved through the scrub grass in a constant, live sound. Augusta had camped before and needed no managing in the business of setting up for the night. She dealt with December and her bedroll with the ease of someone who has been doing such things since childhood on a ranch. Elijah built a fire with the quiet competence of a man, for whom such things were simply part of existing. They ate in the warm ring of firelight, beans and dried beef and biscuits that Augusta had packed, and the ordinary domesticity of eating a meal together in the middle of nowhere had a quality to it that was unexpectedly settling. Not intimate in a way that crossed any line, but comfortable in the way that true comfort is, unforced and easy. "Tell me about the man," Elijah said, meaning Holt, and Augusta laid out everything she knew with the clarity of someone who has been turning the same set of facts over for weeks and has them completely organized in her mind. She told him about the land company and the banking connections and the specific properties that had been taken. She told him about the two ranching families she knew of personally, whose foreclosures had never made full sense, including the Delacroix family, who had left the county the previous fall with what she was now fairly certain was a deliberately engineered bankruptcy. She told him about the letter Thomas had sent to a friend in Amarillo 2 months before his death, and how that friend had never written back. Elijah listened with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and when she finished he was quiet for a while. "This is larger than I thought," he said. "I believe it goes into the county government," Augusta said. "The commissioner, Fetterman, is named in those letters. And I think Prout knows more than he's letting on." "Prout's scared," Elijah said. "That's different from being involved, though the end result isn't much different for you." He looked at her. "You should know that if we take this to the marshals and they move on Holt, there will be men who are not happy about it, and some of those men may have particular feelings about you." "I'm aware of that," Augusta said. "I'm not trying to frighten you." "You're not frightening me," she said, which was the truth. She had been frightened, thoroughly and legitimately, for 3 weeks. What she had now was something past fear, the particular calm that lives on the other side of deciding to act regardless. Elijah looked at her with that same quality of attentiveness she had noticed in the sheriff's office that morning, as if he was reading something in her that confirmed a previous assessment. He nodded once, and went back to watching the fire. They slept on opposite sides of it with the professional matter-of-factness of two people who are being practical rather than performing propriety. Augusta lay awake for a while looking at the wide, uncompromising field of stars above the Texas Panhandle, and thought about the fact that exactly one person in 3 weeks had looked at her evidence and said, without hesitation, "Let me see it." She fell asleep thinking about gray-green eyes. The second day of riding covered a good 40 miles of rolling country, scrub and limestone and the occasional stand of mesquite, with the sky running ahead of them clean and enormous. They found their rhythm together on the trail, in the natural way of people who are not fighting the space between them. Augusta noticed, not for the first time, that Elijah rode with a particular kind of ease around her, not the careful, managing ease of a man trying to be appropriate, but something more straightforward than that, as if her presence was simply a good and unremarkable thing. She asked him about Missouri, and he told her about a farm outside Jefferson City where he had grown up the middle child of 5, his father raising corn and pigs on land that barely supported either. He described it without nostalgia and without bitterness, just the plain factual quality of someone recounting a place that had formed them but not held them. He had left at 18, he said, and had not gone back except once for his mother's funeral when he was 24. "Do you have people?" she asked. "2 brothers in Kansas," he said. "We write occasionally. It's not much, but it's something." She told him about her own family, her parents who had come to Texas from Georgia when she was 7, her father's failed attempts at farming in increasingly dry country, the way she had grown up understanding before she had words for it that the land did not owe anyone a living. She told him about meeting Thomas at 19 at a church social in a town 60 miles east of Redemption Creek, about the courtship that had been practical and unromantic in its external facts and entirely romantic in everything that mattered, about the 8 years of their marriage, which had been good years despite the hardness of the life, about the baby girl they had lost 3 years in, who had lived 4 days, whose name had been Elise, and whose small grave was on the eastern edge of the property. She had not talked about Elise to anyone outside of Thomas and Mrs. Pell. She had not meant to say it now. But something about the open country and the quality of this man's listening had loosened something in her that she had held carefully closed. Elijah did not offer condolences in the way that people offered condolences, with the practiced, helpless kindness of those who do not know what else to do. He said, "She was real to you," and it was exactly the right thing, because it acknowledged what no one else had, that a 4-day life was still a life, was still a person, was still a loss that didn't diminish with the brevity of the time. Augusta was quiet for a little while after that, not uncomfortably. She noticed she was not uncomfortable with him in any of the ways she had expected to be uncomfortable sharing a trail with a man she did not know. There was nothing in him that required managing or interpreting or guarding against. He simply was what he appeared to be, which was, she was coming to understand, an extremely rare quality in a human being. The second night's camp was near a limestone overhang that gave them some shelter from the wind, which had picked up in the late afternoon and was carrying the sharp smell of a storm somewhere to the northwest. They made a smaller fire, tucked back from the wind. The proximity of the shelter meant they were sitting closer to each other than the previous night, which neither of them remarked on and both of them were aware of. Elijah, looking out at the dark landscape with a cup of coffee warming his hands, said, "I want you to know something." Augusta waited. "I had a wife," he said, 4 years ago. She died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1878 in Abilene." He paused. He was speaking with the careful precision of someone who has learned to talk about something painful without being destroyed by it each time, but has not entirely lost the difficulty of the subject. Her name was Clara. She was 26. Augusta felt the weight of that settle around her, the specific shared weight of those who have lost someone in the particular way that grief rearranges everything that comes after. "I'm sorry," she said, as simply and directly as he had said it to her. He nodded. "I tell you because I think you understand what it changes," he said. "Not that it takes things away, though it does that, but that it changes the shape of what you are afterward. And I've met people who looked at me after and didn't understand that shape, because they were looking for the person before." "Yes," she said, and the single syllable was full of recognition. He looked at her then across the small fire, and the look was not investigative or calculating but simply present, one person actually seeing another person, which is both more common and rarer than it should be. "Those papers you're carrying," he said, shifting back to the practical, which felt like a small mercy to both of them. "What do you want to happen at the end of this?" She thought about it genuinely, as she had thought about it many times, but answering it aloud to someone who was asking seriously was different. "Justice," she said. "Not the word of it, the actual thing. I want Holt held accountable. I want the families whose land was taken to have some recourse. I want it to cost him what it cost Thomas. And after that," she let out a breath, "I want to keep the ranch," she said. "Not because of Thomas, or not only, because it's my land and I know every inch of it and I have worked as hard on it as he did, and I will not have it taken by a man who got rich stealing from people smaller than himself." Elijah nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Why good?" "Because that's worth fighting for," he said. "It's clear and it's right. And clear, right things are the easiest to stay the course on when it gets difficult." The storm that had been approaching from the northwest skirted around them in the night and left them with only a brief rattling rain that lasted 20 minutes and then blew itself out. Augusta lay listening to it on the limestone and thought that she had not felt less alone in 3 weeks than she did in this moment, which was both a comfort and the beginning of something more complicated. They reached the outskirts of Amarillo on the afternoon of the 3rd day, coming in from the south along a road that was increasingly traveled, passing freight wagons and a small cattle drive going the other direction, and eventually the scattered outskirts of a city that, by 1882 standards in the Texas Panhandle, was a substantial thing. Amarillo was the Panhandle's commercial center, a railhead town that had exploded in size since the Fort Worth and Denver City Railroad had begun laying track toward it, and it had the particular energy of a place that believed very firmly in its own future. The U.S. Marshal's office was a solid brick building 2 blocks from the main commercial street. Augusta had never been inside it. She straightened her bonnet and gripped the satchel and walked through the door with Elijah at her shoulder, and for the first time in 3 weeks the door did not close against her. The marshal on duty was a man named Whitfield, a lean and gray-bearded veteran of the sort that the marshal service produced occasionally, men who had been doing this long enough to have shed all patience for nonsense and all tolerance for intimidation, and who looked at the world with the steady, unimpressible gaze of someone who has seen most of what it has to offer. He sat Augusta down at his desk and he looked at the documents with the methodical, thorough attention that they deserved. He did not tell her she was grieving. He did not suggest she rest. He read every page. Elijah sat against the wall and said almost nothing, which was exactly right, because this was Augusta's evidence and Augusta's cause, and it was Augusta who needed to be speaking for it. When Whitfield asked a question about the chain of custody of a particular document, it was Augusta who answered. When he wanted to understand the timeline of Thomas's investigation, it was Augusta who laid it out. Elijah was there as what he had said he would be, someone who would look at it and would not pretend not to see what he saw, which was a specific, valuable thing. When Whitfield put the last paper down, he looked at Augusta for a moment with an expression she had not seen in 3 weeks. It was the expression of a man who is taking something seriously. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I want you to understand what this means. If we move on Holt based on this evidence, we are moving on one of the most powerful landholders in the Panhandle. This will not be quick and it will not be quiet." "I know," she said. "You may be called to testify. You may be subpoenaed. It will require your testimony regarding how and where these documents were found. I understand that. And in the interim," Whitfield said, "you may face pressure from Holt's representatives to drop the matter or to sell your property at whatever price they offer." "They've already sent me a letter," Augusta said. "I want that letter," Whitfield said. She had brought it. She had brought everything. Whitfield took a deputy aside for a low conversation, then came back to his desk and wrote 2 letters, one to the county commissioner's office citing an ongoing federal investigation, and one to the county land recorder's office placing a hold on any property transactions associated with the Brooks Ranch. He handed Augusta copies of both. "Nobody is taking your land while this investigation is open," he said. "I can promise you that much." Augusta held the copies of those letters and felt something release in her chest that had been clenched since the morning she had found Thomas's papers in the false bottom of his desk. It was not victory. It was not justice yet. But it was the first real, official, institutional acknowledgement that what she was saying was true and worth protecting. And after 3 weeks of being turned away, it felt enormous. She thanked Whitfield, who accepted her thanks with the minimal gruff nod of a man who did not require it. She and Elijah walked out of the marshal's building into the Amarillo afternoon, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk with the 2 letters in her hand and the satchel against her side and let the reality of it settle. "You did that," Elijah said. She looked at him. He was watching her with something that was not quite a smile but was in the same country as one. The afternoon light was full on his face, and the gray-green of his eyes was decisively green in this particular light, which she filed away without meaning to. "We did that," she said. "I sat in a chair," he said. "You stood up in a room where every other man sat down," she said. "That isn't nothing." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched just past the ordinary length of such things and then looked away down the street. "We should get the horses settled and find somewhere to sleep," he said. "It'll be a long ride back." They stayed one night in Amarillo, at a respectable hotel that had separate rooms and a dining room that served a proper supper, which after 3 days on the trail was a thing of considerable pleasure. They ate at a table across from each other, and the conversation moved differently than it had on the trail. Less about the business of the journey and more about everything else. The town and the food, and the oddly civilized quality of sitting at a table with silverware after several days of beans and firelight. At one point, Elijah said something dry about the nature of hotel gravy that made Augusta laugh, genuinely and completely, for the first time since Thomas's death, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her so much that she stopped and looked down at her plate. "Don't apologize for that," Elijah said quietly. She looked up. "I wasn't going to," she said. "Good," he said, and there was something warm in his voice, something careful and real. She lay awake a long time that night in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the town, and turned over the preceding 3 days in her mind the way you turn over something new and unexpected. She was a widow. She was in the middle of a legal fight that was not finished and would not be finished quickly. She had met this man 4 days ago, and they had spent most of those 4 days in each other's company, and she trusted him with the kind of certainty that normally took much longer to earn. She did not want to think about what else she might be feeling because it seemed premature and perhaps unreasonable, but the feeling was there regardless, a warmth that was distinct from gratitude, a specific attentiveness to his presence that went beyond the practical. She told it to wait, the feeling, and she went to sleep. The ride back to Redemption Creek took 3 days again, the same country but somehow different on the return, perhaps because the purpose of it had changed from urgent to accomplished. They talked more easily, filling the miles with longer conversations that ranged widely. Elijah told her about a cattle drive he had worked as a young man on the Kishom Trail, the way it had looked at dusk with 3,000 longhorns moving through the dust and the sounds of it, a city of animals in motion. He told her about a winter he had spent in a scouts camp in New Mexico territory, working for a survey party, and how he had learned from an old Apache guide named Kessany how to read the land in ways that European-descended people had systematically trained themselves out of understanding. He said this not with the superior air of someone performing their own broad-mindedness, but with the genuine respect of a man who had actually paid attention and learned something. Augusta, who had grown up in a part of Texas where the relationships between settlers and the various peoples who had been there before them were enormously complicated and were the subject of enormous hypocrisy, appreciated the honesty of it. She knew well that the expansion of ranching into the Panhandle had come at a cost that the territory's official narrative did not particularly acknowledge, and she had always felt the dishonesty of that silence. "My father," she said, "used to say that the land belonged to whoever could work it. I think he believed it, but I also think it was a useful thing to believe when you wanted what was on someone else's land." "Most convenient beliefs are convenient for a reason," Elijah said. "Thomas used to say that justice wasn't something the land had," Augusta said, "but that people were responsible for making it. He said if you left justice to happen on its own, it mostly didn't." "Sounds like a man worth knowing," Elijah said. "He was," she said. On the second night of the return journey, they camped again in open country, and the fire was smaller because the weather had warmed and they built it more for light than heat. They sat closer to each other this time, not by design but by the natural gravity of familiarity, and Augusta was aware of the fact of his shoulder perhaps 2 feet from her own, in a way that was pleasant and startling in equal measure. They were talking about nothing particularly important, the relative merits of different trail food, the question of whether December's slight favoring of her left foreleg was anything to be concerned about, when Elijah said, without any particular preamble, "I haven't felt settled anywhere since Clara died. I've moved around so much I've stopped being able to tell if I'm looking for something or just moving because staying feels wrong." Augusta was quiet, listening. "I don't say that as a complaint," he said. "It's just a true thing. I know what I am and what I've been doing, and I'm not sure it suits me as well as it used to." "What would suit you?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and in the firelight there was a directness in his expression that was different from the usual quality of his attention, closer to the surface of something. "I'm not entirely sure," he said, "but I find myself having some ideas about it that I didn't have a week ago." Augusta held his gaze for a moment. The fire crackled between them. The night was very large and very quiet. She said carefully, "I think the world is easier when you have someone to come back to." "Yes," he said. "That's what I've been missing, not the staying, the coming back." It was not a declaration, and she was not ready for a declaration, and he seemed to understand this perfectly because he left it exactly where it was, a true statement between two people who were paying attention to each other, and went back to looking at the fire. She was in love with him by the time they rode back into Redemption Creek. She did not announce this to herself. She simply acknowledged it privately, the way you acknowledge the weather, as a fact of the world rather than a choice you have made about it. It was too soon by most reasonable measures, and too real to dismiss by any measure she had access to. Redemption Creek received them with its usual indifference, which was to say that the dust settled around them, and the buildings stood at their usual crooked angles, and the street was populated with the usual morning commerce of a cattle town. Sheriff Prout was not visible. Neither was Calloway or Marsh. Augusta thought Prout was probably finding the window of his office very interesting indeed. Elijah rode with her to the edge of her property, and dismounted at the gate the way he had dismounted throughout the journey, practically and without ceremony. He helped her settle December, checked the loose shoe that the Amarillo farrier had tightened and confirmed it was holding, and then stood in the familiar space of her yard with his hat in his hand in a way that made him look, just for that moment, younger than he usually did. "What happens now?" she asked. "Whitfield will begin his investigation," he said. "It will take some months, possibly more. You'll want to keep copies of those documents in a safe place separate from the originals. Don't meet with any of Holt's people without a witness." "I know all that," she said. "I meant what happens with you." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to stay in Redemption Creek for a while," he said, "if there's work to be found. And I'd like to make sure you're all right through whatever comes next, if you'll allow it." "I'll allow it," she said. Something shifted in the quality of air between them, a small, significant shift, and then both of them returned to being practical because they were practical people and the day had several remaining hours. In the weeks that followed, Elijah found work at the Hartley cattle operation north of town, which needed a competent hand and did not ask too many questions. He had a room at the town's boarding house, a narrow but clean space that he occupied with the minimal neatness of someone accustomed to having only what he needed. He came by Augusta's property with a frequency that increased naturally over those weeks, first on the pretext of keeping her informed of anything he heard about Holt's response to the federal investigation, which had leaked into local knowledge faster than Augusta had expected. The response was significant. Holt's lawyers descended on the county like a weather event. There were letters, there were meetings, there was an editorial in the Courier, which had apparently found its courage once it had the cover of federal jurisdiction, questioning the legitimacy of the investigation. There were attempts, some more subtle than others, to pressure Augusta into dropping the matter or selling the property. A man she didn't know stopped her on the street and told her in a carefully pleasant voice that she ought to consider what a fresh start somewhere else might offer a young widow. She told him precisely what she thought of that suggestion, in language she had learned from Thomas during a particularly difficult calving season, and the man went away looking startled. Elijah had been with her when this happened, having ridden into town that afternoon to escort her to the telegraph office, where she sent a wire to Marshal Whitfield's office regarding the attempted intimidation. When the unknown man retreated, Elijah said nothing for a moment and then said, "That was comprehensive. I'm not feeling particularly temperate today," she said. "I noticed," he said, and there was a warmth in it, an admiration that he was not bothering to hide. Their time together settled into a rhythm over those weeks that felt, from the inside, inevitable, the particular inevitability of two people who are well matched in temperament discovering that they want to spend their time in the same place. He helped on the ranch when there was work that needed more than one person. She cooked dinner on the evenings when he came by, because she cooked anyway and it was natural to cook for two. They talked for hours on the porch after the day's work was done, and the subjects ranged so widely and kept touching such similar places in both of them that Augusta sometimes felt it as a physical sensation, the recognition of someone who sees the world through a lens that is shaped like yours. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, about the specific loneliness of being a woman of competence, an opinion in a world that found both qualities inconvenient in her. About the grief for Elise that she had always held alone, because Thomas had his own grief, and she had been so careful not to add to it. About the way she had understood very early in her life that she would have to be stronger than she was expected to be and braver than was comfortable, and she had made her peace with that, but it was still sometimes exhausting. He listened. He responded with the kind of intelligence and honesty that she had stopped expecting to find, the kind that acknowledged complexity without drowning in it. He told her, in turn, about the years after Clara, about the way he had moved through the world in a particular numb kind of competence, doing things well because he knew how to do them, and because there was nothing else to do, and about how the numbness had been lifting gradually without his having noticed it. Until he had walked through a door in a sheriff's office in Redemption Creek and looked at a woman with a satchel clutched against her chest and felt something click into a tension that had been quiet for a long time. That was the night he said it. They were on the porch in the late evening light of a May evening, the sky going its extravagant colors over the flat country, when he said it simply and without preparation. "I am falling in love with you, Augusta. I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to do anything about it, and I understand if the timing is impossible, but I think you deserve to know it as a true thing rather than something I'm leaving you to guess at." Augusta looked at the sky for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you the timing is impossible," she said, "because I don't believe it is. I believe timing is partly a thing that happens to you and partly a thing you choose." She paused. "And I believe I am falling in love with you too." He looked at her with those eyes that were definitely green in this light, and his expression was something she had no single word for, a combination of joy and relief, and the particular tenderness that belongs to people who have been lonely and careful for a long time and are being offered something real. He reached over and covered her hand with his, just that, just the weight and warmth of his hand over hers on the porch railing, and they sat like that as the sky finished doing its work, and the stars came out, and the night settled around them, and neither of them felt it was necessary to say anything more for a while. Summer came to the Texas Panhandle in its characteristically uncompromising way, turning the landscape to gold, and making every afternoon an exercise in the creative management of heat. Augusta ran the ranch through the summer with the mixture of stubbornness and practicality that had always characterized her farming, and with the added resource of Elijah, who had by then essentially extended his association with the Hartley operation to part-time, so that he could spend more hours on the Brooks property. He never moved in, never suggested anything that would compromise her reputation in the community's eyes during a period when her reputation was already under some stress from Holt's people. But he was there most days, and every day of his being there was something she would have resisted losing. The investigation moved forward with the particular pace of federal processes, which is to say steadily and invisibly. Whitfield's office sent a representative to Redemption Creek in June, a quiet man named Graves who spent 3 days reviewing the county records and taking statements, and then departed without announcing his conclusions. Augusta received a letter from Whitfield's office in July acknowledging receipt of her additional testimony and informing her that Fetterman, the county land commissioner, had resigned his position, which she read as a sign that pressure was being applied in the right places. In August, Clarence Holt was indicted. The news came through the telegraph on a Wednesday morning and spread through Redemption Creek with a speed that confirmed how much of the town had been waiting for it. The indictment covered 18 counts of land fraud, 3 counts of falsifying public records, and conspiracy to defraud in connection with the deaths of at least 2 ranchers, including Thomas Brooks. The last item made Augusta sit down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathe very carefully and deliberately for several minutes. Thomas was being officially acknowledged. The thing she had known since the morning she stood at his grave was being officially acknowledged. The legal machinery that had been turned against her, that had told her she was grieving and confused, was now running in the direction of the truth. She allowed herself to cry, properly, for the first time since the 2 times she had cried alone in the weeks after his death. She sat at the kitchen table and cried for Thomas, and for what he had tried to do, and for Elise, and for the years of fighting, and for the sheer relief of being believed by something official and powerful enough to matter. Elijah found her there 20 minutes later when he came in for the midday meal and saw the telegram on the table. He sat down across from her and did not say anything and did not try to make it better or smaller or more manageable. He simply stayed, which was the only thing that was needed. When she had finished, she wiped her eyes and looked at him. "He would have been glad," she said. "I know," Elijah said. "He would have liked you," she said. Elijah considered this for a moment. "I think I would have liked him," he said. "From everything you've told me, he was a man worth knowing." She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat there in the kitchen with the summer heat pressing at the windows and the telegram lying on the table, and the feeling of something enormous having shifted under the world, the particular feeling that comes when justice, which had seemed impossible, turns out to have been possible after all. Holt's trial took place in Amarillo in the fall of 1882. Augusta testified for 2 days, presenting her account of discovering Thomas's papers and her subsequent efforts to bring the evidence to official attention. She testified about the letter from Holt's lawyers. She testified about the man who had stopped her on the street. She testified about Sheriff Pruitt's refusal to act, which Pruitt was present to hear from the back of the courtroom, and whose expression of elaborate discomfort she found she could look at without much sympathy. The trial lasted 11 days. Whitfield had assembled a formidable case that went well beyond what Augusta had provided, drawing on testimony from several other ranching families, from a bank clerk who had been threatened into compliance, and was now finding the inside of an oath considerably more comfortable than the inside of his conscience, and from Fetterman himself, who had made a deal to testify against Holt in exchange for a reduced sentence, which Augusta found imperfect but acceptable. Holt was convicted on 14 of the 18 counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Fetterman received 2 years. 3 of Holt's associates received varying sentences. The Land Commissioner's office was placed under state supervision for a period of 5 years. The properties that had been fraudulently transferred were the subject of a separate civil proceeding that would take another year to fully resolve, but the framework was in place and the direction was clear. The Delacroix family, whom Augusta had been in contact with since the spring, were among the first to have their case reviewed. On the day the conviction came through, Augusta stood outside the Amarillo courthouse in the cool October air and felt the specific, clean feeling of a completed thing. Not happiness, exactly, not yet. Something more serious than happiness, but in the same family as it. Resolution, the feeling of having done what needed to be done and of it having mattered. Elijah was standing beside her. They had been to the courthouse together on each day of the trial. He had sat in the gallery and watched her testify with an expression she had been able to feel from the witness stand, quiet and warm and unwavering. He had brought her coffee from the stand across the street on each morning recess. He had been present in the specific, undemonstrative, steady way that was the most characteristic thing about him. She took his hand on the courthouse steps without thinking about it, and he held it without making a production of it, and they stood there in the October light with the town of Amarillo moving around them, and both of them felt the shift of something ending and something beginning. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. The fall light was doing something specific to his face, bringing out the angles of it, the particular quality of attention in his eyes that she had come to think of as the most beautiful thing she knew. "Elijah," she said. "Augusta," he said. She laughed a little at the echo of it. "I want to go home," she said. "Then let's go home," he said. They rode back to Redemption Creek in 2 days, through a fall landscape that had turned the scrub gold and amber, with the sky running its enormous blue overhead and the air carrying the smell of approaching winter. They talked the whole way back, and the talking felt different now, easier and deeper at the same time, the conversation of two people who know each other well and are no longer holding anything at a careful distance. On the first night of the ride home, Elijah asked her to marry him. He did it sitting across the campfire from her, without any particular ceremony, in the direct, honest way that characterized everything about him. He said he loved her and that he had no wish to spend any more time than necessary not being married to her, and that he was not a wealthy man but he was a useful one, and he would work beside her on the Brooks ranch for the rest of his life if she would have him. Augusta looked at him across the fire and felt the particular, perfect clarity of a simple, completely right thing. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He looked so genuinely pleased at that, the simple, unguarded pleasure of it, that she thought she might love him more in that moment than she had yet managed, which was saying something. They were married in Redemption Creek on the 15th of November, 1882, in the same church where Augusta had attended Thomas's funeral 8 months before. It was a small ceremony with no particular ceremony about it, which suited both of them entirely. Mrs. Pell was there, beaming with a conviction that suggested she had seen this coming for some months. Elijah's colleague from the Hartley operation, a good-natured rancher named Pete Alderman who had become his closest friend in town, stood up with him. The minister was a plain-spoken man named Reverend Cole, who did not embellish unnecessarily, and who seemed to understand from looking at the two people in front of him that what was happening was real and did not require decoration. Augusta wore her best dress, which was a deep green that she had owned for 3 years and had always been her favorite, and when Elijah saw her come into the church, he looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way that made Mrs. Pell press a handkerchief to her eyes, and made Augusta's heart do something so thorough and undeniable that she stopped thinking about anything else and just walked toward him. They exchanged plain, simple vows in the plain, clear voices of people who meant every word of them, and Reverend Cole pronounced them married in the sight of God and the people of Redemption Creek. And Elijah kissed her in the straightforward and complete way of a man who has been patient about this for several months and intends the moment to be entirely real. The winter of 1882 and 1883 was a good winter on the Brooks Ranch. Not easy. No winter on the Texas Panhandle was exactly easy, but good in the way that mattered, full and warm in the interior ways that make the exterior hardships manageable. Elijah, who was a skilled and willing rancher, was also a man who made a home in the full sense of the word, not just the practical maintenance of structures and livestock, but the living quality of a place, the warmth of it. He made things, not ostentatiously but with a quiet skill she discovered gradually. He made a new shelf for the kitchen and did not ask whether she wanted it where he planned to put it but showed her the plan first and asked what she thought. He fixed the front door frame that had been slightly wrong for 2 years and had let cold air in at the corner, which Augusta had been meaning to address since the previous winter. He made a small box for her papers, the legal documents and the copies and the letters from Whitfield's office, and lined it with a piece of cloth he had cut from his own worn bandana, which she found so specifically touching that she had to keep herself from saying so several times. She found herself, over those winter months, in possession of a happiness that was different in quality from what she had expected happiness after loss to feel like. She had expected it to feel provisional, overlaid on grief, requiring constant careful management. Instead, it felt solid, built on a foundation that included rather than denied everything that had happened, and this made it more real rather than less. She could speak of Thomas freely, and Elijah listened and remembered details and sometimes asked questions, not because he was managing her, but because he was genuinely interested in the man she had loved. She could speak of Elise, and he held that gently. In the spring of 1883, the civil proceedings regarding the fraudulently transferred properties produced their first results. 3 families received formal acknowledgement of their claims, and the process for restoring their property rights was set in motion. The Delacroix family, who had left the county the previous fall with what Augusta had suspected was a deliberately engineered bankruptcy, wrote to say they intended to return. Augusta wrote back and told them they would be welcomed. The Brooks Ranch's own status had been secured by Whitfield's interim hold and confirmed through the trial proceedings. The 87 acres were definitively Augusta's, and she and Elijah began talking about the practical matter of expanding. There was a parcel to the north that had been vacant since a speculator had purchased it during the land rush and never developed it, and the speculator, having no desire to be associated with any part of the Panhandle's current legal complications, was willing to sell at a reasonable price. They bought it in April, adding 43 acres to the ranch. Augusta stood at the edge of the new land on the morning of the purchase, looking out at the grass that nobody had worked in several years, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has won something back from the world that the world had tried to take. By the summer of 1883, Augusta was carrying their first child. She told Elijah on a June evening on the porch, the same porch where they had first said true things to each other, with the same enormous sky above them doing its summer performance. She told him plainly, without prelude, which was how she did everything, and he went very still in the way that people go still when something large has landed. Then he looked at her, and his face did what it rarely did. It lost its composed steadiness and simply showed her everything, the joy and the weight of it and the love and the specific quality of a man who has been given something he had stopped believing would come to him again. "Augusta," he said, and her name in his voice like that was its own complete thing. "I'm well," she told him, understanding what was underneath the surface of his expression. "I'm healthy. I'm going to be fine." "I know," he said. "I know you are." He reached over and pulled her close, and she let herself be held without argument for once, which was itself a measure of how much she trusted him. The pregnancy was good and steady and productive, in keeping with Augusta's general approach to things. She did not slow down by much, and Elijah did not attempt to make her, which was wise of him, though he did quietly take over more of the heavier work without making any announcement of this redistribution, simply doing it, which she appreciated. The child was born in February of 1884, a boy, strong-lunged and vigorous in his opinions from the first moment, which Elijah said boded well, and Augusta said she would reserve judgment on. They named him Thomas, which Elijah had suggested without prompting, and which had made Augusta press her lips together hard against the feeling it produced, and then nod and say yes, that was exactly right. Thomas Elijah Sheridan was a large, emphatic presence in the world from the beginning, and the Brooks Ranch, which had stood empty of children through the difficult years and the grief years and the years of legal battles, was now full of the sounds of a baby, with strong opinions about most things and a father who held him with the particular, careful tenderness of a large man handling something precious. Augusta, watching them together on the morning light of a spring day when the baby was perhaps 6 weeks old, and Elijah was walking slowly around the kitchen with Thomas on his shoulder, because this was the only thing that made the boy tolerate being awake without announcing his displeasure, felt the completeness of something she had not known she was still building toward. It was not the replacement of what she had lost. It was something that existed alongside that, its own whole thing. The Redemption Creek community had largely resolved itself around the changed situation, with a pragmatism that was characteristic of frontier towns. Pruitt had resigned his position as sheriff in December, The combination of the trial testimony regarding his inaction and the general shift in local sentiment having made his position untenable. His replacement was a younger man named Delacroix, which was the universe's sense of humor asserting itself. He was no relation to the displaced ranching family, but the coincidence pleased Augusta regardless. Sheriff Delacroix was, by all indications, a genuine and competent lawman who actually wanted to do the job. Calloway had taken himself to a neighboring county where he became, from what Augusta heard, moderately better at his work in the absence of Holt's particular local influence. Marsh had stayed on under the new sheriff and seemed, in the absence of Pruitt's example, to be discovering that actual law enforcement was both possible and preferable to its alternative. The newspaper editor, whose courage had returned with the force of a man overcompensating for previous cowardice, had run 3 lengthy pieces on the Holt case and its implications for land rights in the Panhandle, and had sent Augusta a letter of apology that was sincere enough that she had forgiven him, which she did without fanfare because she was not in the business of holding grievances past their useful point. In 1885, 3 years after the day Augusta Brooks had walked into the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office with a satchel full of evidence, and every man in the room had looked away, she and Elijah rode together to the county courthouse to file the completed title transfer on the expanded Brooks Sheridan property. The paperwork was signed and stamped by a land commissioner who had been appointed under state supervision and who had no particular allegiances to anyone who was currently in federal prison. The ranch, the original 87 acres and the 43 they had added and another 20 that had come available the previous fall, was 150 acres, free and clear and properly titled. They came home on a September afternoon to find young Thomas, now 18 months and in full command of his locomotion, being watched by Mrs. Pell in the yard, where he had discovered the considerable entertainment value of the water trough, and was attempting to communicate this discovery through a sophisticated combination of pointing and shouting that he had developed as his primary mode of address. Elijah dismounted and swept the boy up onto his shoulders in a practiced move that Thomas accepted as his due, and they stood there in the yard, Augusta still on December's back looking down at them, with the afternoon light coming across the flat country in the long gold angle of late summer. And she thought about the morning 3 years ago, when she had pushed open the door of the sheriff's office, not knowing what she was walking into, knowing only that she would not stop until someone paid attention. One man had stood up. She loved him every day in the direct, unceremonious, completely real way that she did most things, without excessive demonstration and without any holding back. He loved her in the steady, attentive, morning and evening way of a man who knows what he has and does not take the knowledge for granted. They argued occasionally, over practical things and over the occasional impractical things, with the forthrightness of 2 people who trust each other enough not to perform agreement. They made each other laugh with a frequency that neither of them had expected, and both of them were quietly grateful for. The ranch ran well under the partnership of 2 capable and compatible people, growing steadily through the second half of the decade as the Panhandle continued its expansion, and the cattle business evolved, and the railroad moved the economics of the region. Elijah proved to have a gift for the business side of ranching that complemented Augusta's gift for the land itself, and together they built something that was neither of them alone, but was entirely both of them together. In the spring of 1886, Augusta told Elijah she was pregnant again. He received this news on the same porch, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that loss of composure, that complete showing of everything, which she had come to know as the most honest version of him. Their second child was a girl, born in the deep cold of January 1887, and they named her Clara because it was the right name, because the woman whose name it was deserved to be remembered and honored, And because Augusta had understood from the beginning that building a good life with Elijah meant honoring the entirety of who he was, including the grief that had shaped him into the man she loved. Clara was dark-haired and bright-eyed and absolutely certain of her own importance from the age of approximately 3 weeks, which meant she and her brother Thomas were exceptionally well matched in temperament, and the house was never quiet. By the end of the decade, the Redemption Creek community had changed substantially. The railroad had reached further west and the town had grown. New businesses had opened. Families had arrived and settled. The legacy of Holt's land fraud scheme was still being untangled in certain corners of the county, with civil cases still moving through the courts, and the Delacroix family having returned and begun building again, and several other families having received various degrees of redress for what had been taken from them. Augusta had testified in 3 of those subsequent civil proceedings, each time bringing the same clarity and steadiness she had brought to the original case. She had become, without seeking it, a woman that other people in difficult situations found their way to, not because she encouraged it, but because the story had become known, and people who needed someone who would not look away when presented with inconvenient evidence had figured out where to go. She did not see this as a purpose or a calling. She saw it as the ordinary work of being someone who paid attention and acted on what she saw, which was what Thomas had done, and what she continued to do in his name and in her own. On a September evening in 1889, 7 years after the morning she had walked through the door of the sheriff's office, and 9 months before the decade turned, Augusta and Elijah sat on the porch of the Brooks Sheridan ranch. The house had been expanded in 1887 to accommodate the larger family, with a second sleeping room added and the kitchen extended, and a proper covered porch that could hold chairs and a table for evenings like this one. Thomas, now 5, was inside with Clara, aged 2, and the sounds they produced were the background music of a life in the fullest possible use. The sun was going down over the flat Panhandle country in the way it did in September, without hurry, spreading itself gold and rose across the entire visible horizon. The evening star had appeared in the first blue of the east. The land ran away from them in every direction as if it would go on forever, which in a certain functional sense it did. Elijah's hand was in hers, as it was on most evenings, the same way the conversation between them was always present even in silence, because they had long since ceased to need to fill the silence with sound, and had come to inhabit it together as the comfortable, companionable thing it was. "I was thinking about something today," Augusta said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about the day I walked into Pruitt's office," she said. "I've thought about it many times, but today I was thinking about it from the other angle, about what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Elijah was quiet, thinking with her rather than rushing past the thought. "I would have gone somewhere else," she said. "I would not have stopped. I was not going to stop." "No," he agreed, "you were not." "But it would have been harder," she said. "Longer, more alone." She looked at him. "I am glad you walked through that door." He looked back at her, his eyes in the evening light definitively the gray-green of deep shade, and the expression in them was everything she had come to know, the steadiness and the attention and the warmth that he kept carefully but did not hide from her. "I am glad I wanted it," he said, meaning the evidence, meaning her, meaning everything that had followed from the choice he had made without deliberation in a sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning 7 years ago, to pick up something that everyone else had set down. Augusta leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy, habitual way of long-established intimacy, and looked out at the country that was hers, that was theirs. The land that Thomas had worked and she had fought for, and Elijah had helped her keep. The land where Elise was buried and Thomas Jr. ran and Clara was beginning to find her feet. The land that ran all the way to the horizon and beyond it, indifferent to everything that happened on its surface, requiring everything they could give it and returning something more. Inside the house, Clara laughed at something her brother did, a bright, complete sound that carried through the evening air and dissolved into it and left its shape behind. Elijah turned his face and pressed his lips to her hair, which was still dark and still practical and still pinned in the way of a woman who does not have time for ornament, and she felt the warmth of it settle around her like the evening itself, like the kind of thing that becomes so much a part of your ordinary life that you almost stop noticing it except in the specific, deliberate moments when you remember to notice it, and it is everything. She remembered to notice it. She noticed it every day. The satchel with its documents was in the wooden box he had made for her, in the corner of the bedroom, under a quilt she had sewn the winter after their marriage. She had not looked at it in years. She did not need to look at it. It had done its work. It had carried the truth from a desk drawer in a dead man's study to the hands of the one man in a room full of men who had been willing to look at it, and everything that had come after had followed from that. The long chain of consequence that had led from one small act of decency to this porch, this evening, these children, this life. The star in the east was bright now, and the first cool of the autumn evening was coming in on the wind off the high plains, and Augusta Brooks, who was Augusta Sheridan now, who had been widowed and frightened and dismissed, and had gotten back up each time and kept walking through whatever door would open, breathed in the evening air of the land she had fought for and felt, completely and without reservation, at home. The end of the sky was turning purple, the deep color that comes at the last of the light. Thomas called from inside the house, wanting something with the specificity of a 5-year-old boy who has decided the world should provide it immediately. Elijah stood and squeezed her hand and went inside, and she heard his voice, low and amused and patient, attending to whatever the immediate crisis was, and she heard Thomas subside and Clara laugh again. Augusta stayed on the porch another moment, looking at the sky. She thought of Thomas, her first husband, and the way he had pressed those papers into her hands in the dark bedroom and trusted her to carry them forward when he could not. She thought of Elise. She thought of all the doors that had been shut, and the one door that had opened from the inside, when a man she had never met had walked through a back room with a coffee cup and looked at her and said, plainly, "Let me see it." She felt the full weight and the full gift of her life, both of them together, neither one canceling the other. She stood, smoothed her dress, and went inside to her family.